Salve! Hello! Welcome to a podcast lecture on Catullus 1 for Haverford College's Latin 101. Before you view this lecture, you should have already read the poem. Once you are ready to begin, let's begin. First with a reading, then a translation, and finally we will move into interpreting this poem. Here's the poem read out loud. Try and follow along the best you can. Qui dono lepidum novum libellum erida modo pumic expolitum? Corneli tibi, namque tu solebas meas es aliquid putare nugas. Iam tum quausus est unus Italorum omnium tribus explicare cartis doctis Jupiter et laboriosis. Qua rabet tibi quidquid hoc libelli qualicumque, quod o patrona Virgo plus uno maneat perenne cyclo. And now I will read a translation of the poem. I will read through it in its entirety first. Then we will go through it again, more slowly, and look at specific forms and constructions, before turning to some of the interpretive questions this poem presents. Here's the translation. To whom do I give this chic booklet, recently polished up with a dry pumice? Cornelius, to you. Since you were accustomed to think my trifles amounted to something, even when you dared, alone of all the Italians, to unfold the whole past in 3 papyri, learned, by Jupiter, and laborious. So take this mere booklet such as it is, and this, my maiden, my patroness, let it last for more than one continual generation. Now I will read through my translation again, slowly, so that you can see exactly how the Latin forms its meaning. To whom do I give this new chic booklet, recently polished up with a dry pumice? So our poem begins with a question, introduced by none other than an interrogative pronoun. Notice how the core meaning of the sentence is completed in the very first line. Indirect object, verb, with the implied subject, and direct object, and how this complete thought is then expanded in the second line. Expolitum is a perfect passive participle, agreeing with libellum. Since there is a passive verbal, we'd naturally like to know who or what the agent might be, and Catullus doesn't disappoint. There is an ablative of means right where we'd expect it, nestled before the participle. Let's move along to the next sentence, which begins, Cornelius, to you. Since you were accustomed to think my trifles amounted to something. Corneli is a vocative. Remember that the vocative of second declension nouns ending in ius is just long I. Tibi, in the dative, answers the question posed by qui at the start of the poem. Note the emphasis on Cornelius with the vocative and 2 personal pronouns, tibi and tu, in the same line. Solebas introduces a complementary infinitive, putare, in the next line, which itself introduces an indirect statement, consisting of an accusative and a modifying adjective, here positioned at the beginning and end of the line. Notable, remarkable in fact, but perfectly common in poetry. And finally, the infinitive esse and the object aliquid. The poem continues with a cum clause, slightly delayed by the introductory iam tum, both temporal markers. Our verb ausus est is indicative, so we know this cum clause suggests only that what Cornelius dared happened at the same time as when Catullus offered Cornelius his booklet. If there were a causal implication, since, because, or concessive, although, then the verb would of course be in the subjunctive. Ausus est, like solebas above, takes a complementary infinitive, which appears on the following line, explicare, with omne aevum as its direct object. tribus cartis explains how Cornelius unfolded the past, and so is an ablative of means, or perhaps manner. As in the beginning of the poem, the completed thought in lines 5 and 6 is then expanded by one more descriptive line. We saw this in line 2 before. Here, two adjectives, elegantly appearing at the beginning and ending of the line, enclose an address to Jupiter. The call on Jupiter should not be taken as a real prayer. It is like the English, "Dear God," an intense exclamation, but not an actual religious moment. The poem closes with 3 lines that explain what Cornelius can do with Catullus' booklet, and a hope that it will outlast its author. Habe tibi is an idiom meaning roughly take or consider. Quidquid hoc libelli is its object, with libelli a partitive genitive with an indefinite quidquid. This is a very common Latin construction. The lengthy qualicumque, enjambed on the next line, agrees with quidquid. Quad is a connective relative, which links its sentence very closely to the sentence that preceded it. It has roughly the same force as hoc, this, meaning this quidquid, this whatever of a booklet that Catullus is talking about. Virgo must refer to a muse, the poet's patrona, but the usage is unusual for Catullus and worth considering. At any rate, he prays, with the jussive subjunctive manayat, that this, the relative that began the sentence as a direct object of the verb, last longer. Plus, with the ablative of comparison, here elaborated in 3 parts, uno perenne cyclo. And so, there is Catullus 1, a short poem that introduces a collection, his booklet or libellum, and addresses a certain Cornelius. Now perhaps your first question might be, Cornelius who? Addressing a poem to Cornelius in Rome in the 1st century BC is a little like addressing one to Mike or John today. It's not exactly overflowing with information. Now your commentary will tell you who this Cornelius is. He's Cornelius Nepos, the first Italian author of a universal history. He's best known now for his biographies of famous men, both Romans and non-Romans alike. Like Catullus, Cornelius was from northern Italy, but their connection is deeper than that. Cornelius is learned, precise, painstaking, and innovative. He'd have to be to write a universal history in only 3 rolls of papyrus. We might say, then, that Cornelius is a prose version of Catullus, bursting onto the Roman literary scene, an outsider by birth whose brilliance has granted him access to the center of Roman society, which previously was the playground of only the senatorial elite, the Romans of Rome. Both are a new breed, the Romans of Italy, who in the aftermath of the social war are starting to press their social and their political rights in the face of the stodgy conservative Roman elite. Here then we see the importance of Catullus's choice of calling Cornelius the first of the Italians. A wider social consciousness is developing right before our eyes. And so Catullus doesn't dedicate his collection to a patron of the old elite. He's his own man, and he's arrived. So what tone does Catullus take in this poem? In general, it is light-hearted, with colloquial vocabulary and constructions supplementing a self-deprecating tone. We of course notice immediately that the narrative persona, I, dono, is present from the very second word of the poem. Although we can wonder whether we should equate this narrative I with Catullus, the historical individual, there is no doubting the intimacy present in the poem. It's almost as though we are reading a letter that came to us by chance, or perhaps eavesdropping on a conversation that Catullus had with his friend Cornelius. Let's look at the opening, dono. Even the indicative here hints at informality. We'd expect the deliberative subjunctive, donem, in formal speech. Lepidum, which I translated as chic, but really could be cool or hip or groovy or dope or whatever you kids say today, is an important word to Catullus, as is novum. Catullus' little book, not an epic or magnum opus, but a tiny nothing of a collection, both incredibly stylish and also new, perhaps revolutionary. As often at the opening of a poem or collection, we have a statement of principles here, but Catullus is too clever to just say or explain what he is doing. Instead, he shows us. The colloquial style, the questions and answers, the diminutives, the parentheticals, the unelevated phrases are showing to us, proving to us, that lyric poetry can be about daily topics in colloquial speech. Catullus is showing how poetry, in short, doesn't need to be poetry with a capital P, but can be intimate and familiar while still being clever. And this is the importance of the second line of the poem, polished, elegant, expert. Catullus's intimate poetry will not be slapdash, but carefully considered. The poetry will be serious, even if the topic and the language may be silly, coarse, sappy, or vulgar. We can see the care lavished on this supposedly careless little poem best in the attention Catullus has paid to its meter and sound. You may have to take my word for this at this point, but the first 3 lines are something special, metrically speaking. Each line begins with one of the 3 metrical variations possible in this meter. Qui dono, arida, corneli. An iamb, da-da, a trochee, da-da, and a spondee, da-da. And in fact, this variation itself is highly unusual. Catullus himself will not do something similar in the rest of his poems, and we know that his predecessors likewise avoided such patterns. Subtle? Sure, but undeniable, a joke or hint to his poetics accessible only to the initiated, and now, you. More immediately noticeable is the careful patterning of sounds that tie this poem together. We see the significant echo of expolitum in line 2, what Catullus has done to his collection, polished it up, with how Catullus describes Cornelius's own composition in line 6, explicare, expolitum, explicare. We also see it in the almost soothing cadences of M and N sounds that run throughout the poem, especially the sound emphasized in the first line, which then echoes throughout the poem, although it's eventually overtaken by N's. In the first line, lepidum novum libellum, then pumice expolitum cum italorum aevum quaecumque, and then in the end, uno maniat perenne. These are complemented by O sounds throughout. When the M and N's withdraw in the middle section of the poem, we have repeated S sounds, solebas, meas, esse, nugas, ausus es, unus, tribus, cartis, doctis, laboriosis. And we also perceive how hard C's and Q's start off the poem, subside, then return with a flurry in the more confident ending, where they are supplemented by a forceful P, patrona plus perenne. These patterns create a kaleidoscope of sound, a feast for the ears, that with great skill unite the poem into a single, coherent work. There is so much more we could look at in this poem, but for now, let's end where we began, with that little word libellum that begins our poem. The question of who gets it has been replaced by acting out of the giving of the booklet. Here it is. It's yours, Cornelius. But the poem doesn't stop there. The repetition of libelli is a false ending, and Catullus continues, first with a further deprecation, qualicumque, whatever it is. But then there's a change in style and tone. Suddenly there's an invocation of the muse after all, that most poetic and high style of effects, and a cautious, perhaps confident call that his little nothing of a booklet, that Catullus supposedly only gave to Cornelius, will in fact survive for one generation, uno cyclo, but also continually, perenne, forever. In this paradoxical ending, we have a perfect encapsulation of neoteric poetics. What seems on the surface trivial intimate is in fact a powerful statement of the poetic ideals so dear to Catullus and his peers, the so-called new poets, or poetae novi, a term hurled at them derisively by Cicero, but somehow I suspect that Catullus probably didn't mind. I'll leave you today with another reading of the poem. As you listen, try to understand the Latin as you hear it, and also appreciate the complex simplicity that animates Catullus's poetry. Qui dono lepidum novum libellum erida modo pumic expolitum? Corneli tibi, namque tu solebas meas es aliquid putare nugas. Iam tum quausus est unus Italorum omnium tribus explicare cartis doctis Jupiter et laboriosis. Qua rabet tibi quidquid hoc libelli qualicumque, quod o patrona Virgo plus uno maneat perenne cyclo.